So today our guest presenters, first we're joined by Dr. Elizabeth Saewyc. She is the director of SARAVYC. She's a professor in the School of Nursing of UBC and also the associate director of research there. Her research focuses on health issues of youth, particularly how stigma, violence, and trauma influence teens' health, coping, and risk behaviors. She's particularly interested in what protective factors in relationships and environments can buffer trauma for young people. She was the principal investigator for the Canada Trans Youth Health Survey, which we'll be talking about today. And secondly, I'm joined by Jay Jonah, who, as I said, works with YouthREX and is a student here at York and the author of our recent report. Jay is originally from New Brunswick, and he graduated from the University of Prince Edward Island. Jay is openly identified as trans for 5 years and has actively worked to create awareness about the daily struggles of trans-identified people since 2012. So welcome to our presenters, and at this point, I will turn it over to Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to be talking about the first ever nationwide Canadian Trans Youth Health Survey. And of course, I have to start with that official shout out to the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Institute of Gender and Health, which funded our research. Next slide, please. So what the Canadian Trans Youth Health Survey was an online survey of health and risk exposures for youth aged 14 to 25. We had an older version for the 19 to 25-year-olds, a younger version for 14 to 18-year-olds. The survey was in both English and French. And this was not just a survey that was about sort of trans life specifically or trans health issues generally. It was really about a general youth health survey. So everything from eating your vegetables and getting enough sleep and exercise, etc., but also some very specific questions about experiences specific to trans and non-binary and genderqueer youth. A lot of the survey questions were actually drawn from existing population-based surveys like the BC Adolescent Health Survey or the Canadian Community Health Survey. We had several different questions on the survey asking about gender identity, primarily because there's no research that specifically says these are the questions or this is the one question you should ask youth. So what we did instead was we asked a bunch of different ways of asking about gender identity, and we followed up every single one of them with a, okay, so how did you like that question, with an option of them saying everything from I totally hated it to I liked it a lot, and then how well did the response options fit you, with not at all to they totally fit me. So that gave us an opportunity to get feedback on how should we be asking the questions in addition to what the variety of health issues that we asked about. Next slide. So the survey really this project involved a cast of dozens of people across Canada. It included researchers, both Francophone and Anglophone researchers, trans and cisgender researchers from 10 different Canadian universities and clinical hospital settings. We had postgrads, postdoctoral fellows, graduate and undergraduate research assistants, and again, across the spectrum of gender. We had co-researchers from several trans advocate community organizations like Rainbow Health Ontario and the Rainbow Health Initiative in Manitoba and the Youth Project in Nova Scotia and community here in BC. We also had youth advisory councils in several of the provinces who were connected to the research teams to actually provide key feedback on every step of the research along the way. Next slide, please. So this was an amazing survey from my perspective. We ended up with 923 young people from across Canada, including every province, including like 4 people from PE Island. All the territories except for Nunavut and the Yukon. And we had, as you can see from the numbers here, the numbers of youth who participated pretty much represent sort of the general population in Canada, such that you had larger numbers in, say, BC and Ontario and Quebec, and then smaller numbers of participants in the prairies, and like I said, just a few in PE Island. But we did have really good coverage in that respect. We ended up with most of the youth, say 2/3 of them were older youth and about 1/3 were the younger youth. And we had a diversity of ethnic backgrounds and a diversity of gender identities. If you can, next slide, please. Here's one of the examples of questions that were used related to gender identity, which basically was mark all that apply, and people could check off as many of these as they wanted. And there was even an open-ended text option, which is, if we've missed it, is there another word that you would use? And we actually had, even though there's these 16 items here for different options for people, we had 122 people also add another identity label, and a lot of those were things like agender or non-binary. Sometimes they put the same items that were in these terms, but more often than not, it was something else. And 79% of the people who added in something else identified sort of non-binary labels. Next slide. This was another question that was asked pretty early in the survey, and one that people rated positively. Not quite as positively as the last one, because I think people do like the opportunity to have as many different labels, so that something that really sort of matches their particular perspectives about themselves. But this one actually also had a lot of positive response compared to some of the other questions. And in this case, we have 3 different sort of broader categories of trans, sort of trans-masculine, trans-feminine, or a non-binary, trans and identifying outside the spectrum. And it's important to note that 40% of the young people that participated in the survey chose a non-binary gender identity, sometimes genderqueer and other terms. Next slide. So to give you just a little flavor of who these non-binary youth are, to keep in mind what's happening, it's actually quite similar to the overall sample. So again, 63% of the sample and the non-binary youth were older than 19 to 25-year-olds. The majority speak only English at home, but as you can see, that means about 1 in 4 either speak French or other languages at home. The majority are European heritage. About 10% were identified as Aboriginal, and a smaller sprinkling of other ethnic groups, and they varied, of course, across the country. Most of the youth were from Ontario and from BC. And then we saw the Atlantic provinces, Quebec, Alberta, and then a very smaller number from the prairie provinces. Next, please. Now, the key thing is, as I said, we asked about a wide range of health issues, of school environments and exposures to things that actually can contribute to people's health inequities. And so what we found were some fairly high levels of challenges, like 2 out of 3 people reported discrimination because of their gender identity. 70%, so the majority of them had also experienced harassment. 1 in 3 had actually experienced physical assault, and almost half had been cyberbullied. The majority had also reported self-harming in one way or another, and that can be like cutting or other ways of harming yourself, but not intending suicide in the past year. And more than 1 in 3 youth reported having attempted suicide in the past year. We saw 1/3 of the younger youth and half of the older youth had missed out on needed health care in the past year. And only 15% actually felt comfortable talking with their doctors about trans issues, even though more than half of youth actually had family doctors, and about another half went to see walk-in clinics and seeing doctors. As I said, very few felt comfortable. And when it came to walk-in clinics, it was even smaller. Only about 4% felt comfortable talking with their healthcare providers about trans issues in walk-in clinics. Next slide, please. Now, there's some really important things related to, as I said, stigma and resilience among vulnerable youth. Our focus is not just on what are the health inequities, but so what do we do about them, and what are those protective factors in environments and people's lives that actually help buffer some of those health inequities. One of the things we found really important was that when youth had a family doctor and the family doctor knew their trans status and they felt comfortable talking to their doctor, we saw lower levels of self-harm in the last 12 months, like 61% lower odds of reporting self-harm and much higher rates of positive mental health. So those who rated their health as good or excellent were almost twice as likely to rate it as good or excellent if they had a supportive family doctor. Next slide, please. We also see, again, that comfort with your family doctor, that if you're comfortable talking about your trans status with your family doctor, the odds that you're going to report overall good or excellent mental health are more than twice the likelihood, and you have half the odds of self-harm and half the odds of considering suicide in the past year when you have a family doctor that you're comfortable talking about your trans health issues with. Next slide, please. Living in felt gender is another important area because if you think about it, in order to live in your felt gender, that usually means that you have people around you who are supportive of that and it's safe to do so. And youth who reported living in their felt gender full-time were more likely to report excellent or very good health compared to those who lived in their felt gender part-time. And for those who don't live in their felt gender at all, but who feel like they have to be closeted, there are very few of them who actually report excellent or very good health. Now, this is a little more complicated for youth who identify as non-binary or genderqueer. Next slide, please. Because they didn't like being asked, actually, if they were living in their felt gender, and partly that's because as one young person from the Atlantic provinces said, you know, I'm non-binary, I'm genderqueer. Most days I feel like there's no way for me to actually live in my felt gender in a way that other people can understand when they look at me. So that difference between sort of your gender identity and your gender expression, people may not necessarily be able to recognize you living in your felt gender in that respect. So that definition for non-binary youth was definitely a much more complex notion. Next slide, please. We also saw that barriers to hormone therapy, so that is for youth who wanted hormones and actually were experiencing barriers to getting those hormones, and whether that was because of unsupportive family, unsupportive healthcare providers, not being able to find a healthcare provider who would be able to provide those hormones and manage that. But these barriers are really an important issue. Youth who experienced barriers to hormone therapy when they wanted hormones were twice as likely to report self-harm in the past 12 months, twice as likely to report considering suicide in the past 12 months, and half as likely to report good or excellent mental health. Next slide, please. One of the other really important protective factors is family, and family support really matters. What we found among the research we did was that trans and genderqueer youth who had strong family support, who were out to their family and felt really cared about and understood about their family, were 4 times less likely to have self-harmed in the past 12 months. They were more likely to report positive sense of the future. They were more likely to have access to health care. They were more likely to feel better about themselves and to report better health, both physical health and mental health. They were less likely to miss out on needed health care. And so, you know, this is clearly an important element of everyone's life. I mean, we do recognize that family is really important for everyone in terms of young people and as they're developing to be healthy adults. This is the same for trans youth. We do find that trans youth are less likely to be supported by families, but when they do have that strong family support, it really does make a difference. Next slide, please. The full report, because this is just like the really brief lightning speed version of some of the key findings, but the details about the entire survey are available in French and in English, the national reports on our website. I can also say that we're in the midst of preparing our regional reports, and you can look out for the Prairie report to be coming out probably within the next month, and following that we'll have the Ontario report, the Quebec report, the Atlantic report, the BC report, and Alberta over this next year. Next slide, please.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth.
That's it. Thanks.
We'll come back to you in the questions.
Great.
Great. So hi everyone. As was mentioned earlier, I do identify as trans, and I use he and him pronouns. So I'm going to talk more specifically to gender-neutral washrooms and my own lived experience. So what I want to make very clear is that what I'm talking about comes from research that I've done and my own lived experience. I am in no way talking for the entire trans community. As we've just talked about, there's too many identities and ways to identify, and everyone's own experience is rather unique. So I'm only talking from the research that I've done, my own personal experience being trans, and then the experiences that I've known from my friends. So I'm going to talk a little about past research, the biomedical model and issues facing trans youth. I'm also going to talk a little bit in the Ontario context with some of the stepping up themes in youth well-being. I'm going to address some of the major issues in relation to gender-neutral washrooms and safe washroom access. I'm also going to talk about the youth sector, and we're going to conclude with some recommendations that anybody could incorporate into their program or youth service. So from a biomedical perspective, a lot of the past research has focused on the medical experience or the school experience of transitioning. So a lot of when we talked about trans-identified people, we're talking about the hormones, the surgeries. What we're missing is the daily lived experiences and the challenges that we face on a daily basis, whether it's school, with bullying, trying to choose clothing, because that's a major challenge for a lot of us. General body hate and dysphoria. There's also physical and verbal abuse, but there's also different things like job discrimination as well, and being refused a job because you're trans, or being kicked out of your home. There's so many different things that can come into play. And the biomedical understanding or the medical understanding only looks at certain aspects of what it means to be trans. So a lot of the times it's surgery, and there's a debate about whether the biomedical perspective is necessary or not. Coming from my experience, I'm originally from New Brunswick. In order to receive your hormone treatments in New Brunswick, you actually have to be diagnosed with a mental illness in order to receive hormones. So at home, I would have to go to a clinic where I would see a nurse practitioner. The nurse practitioner would then refer me back to my family doctor, who would then have to write a letter stating that I have gender identity disorder or gender dysphoria, and I would have to prove that. Then I have to take that back to the nurse practitioner. And after that, I would have to go through a full physical exam, pap test, everything included. And then after that, I'd have to see a psychiatrist before I could receive my hormones. So there's a really big debate about whether the biomedical approach is necessary. So the way the system is set up right now, you have to, in some instances, you have to have that medical understanding of your identity in order to receive the assistance that you need. When it's better off if you can just self-determine. It's like no one should have to say if you're trans or not. I mean, that's your own personal identity. That's your own experience of it. No one else can tell you what that is. So from Ontario, the Ontario government has, or the Ontario Ministry of Child and Youth Services has 7 stepping up themes for focus areas in relation to youth. I'm specifically going to be talking about the youth well-being, as LGBTQ youth are identified as an area group that needs support. And I'm going to be talking to public washrooms, because public washrooms put into focus like barriers and the binary gender system. So just the 2 boxes of men and women don't fit in a lot of ways for a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. And if you identify as cisgender, sometimes you don't notice this, or you don't see where it could be a problem or how it could be a challenge. But walking through that door publicly identifies you as being one or the other. And it can have consequences too for the youth services and youth programs. Not having access to a safe washroom can be pretty detrimental for a lot of trans youth. So there's like medical things behind it as well. Because some trans youth, if they don't have access to a safe washroom, they will not go to the washroom, and that can lead to a lot of medical conditions, bladder infections, and different things that could lead to more problems down the road. So what I'm hoping to do is to bring awareness to some of the changes that could be made to help accommodate trans youth and to bring them into becoming more inclusive in your programming. So a lot of the debates surrounding gender-neutral washrooms are pretty varied. It's been in the news a lot recently with stuff happening in the US and stuff happening in Canada. I'm specifically not going to talk about the legislation. The reason for this is the debates surrounding gender-neutral washrooms they reoccur, whether it's new legislation or not. The debates pretty much stay the same. So I'm going to stay away from legislation and just talk about the debates themselves. So trans youth should be allowed to use the washroom that they feel most comfortable in. So this is one understanding of what people would like to see. And it's like, so it doesn't matter like what your genitalia is. If you feel more comfortable in the women's, you can go to the women's. If you feel more comfortable in the men's, you go to the men's. If you want to use a gender-neutral accessible washroom, that's your opinion. Nobody should be allowed to tell you which one you have to use based on your genitals. So another one is trans youth should use the washroom based on their sex. This can be extremely complicated in a lot of different ways. I personally actually had a pretty, not detrimental, but a difficult experience 2 weeks ago trying to use a public washroom at a major event here in Ontario. And I personally use the women's washroom because I don't feel comfortable in the men's. I don't necessarily feel comfortable in the women's either. But for me, the women's feels safer because of my genitalia matches what's supposed to be in that washroom. I don't necessarily agree with it, but that's where I feel safest at the moment. And I was almost physically removed from a washroom because I appeared masculine. And I'm masculine enough that I could pass as a man. And I had a lot of women in the washroom staring at me, and I had actually one woman who asked, or actually not really asked, but told me that the men's washroom is over there. So that can become very awkward in a lot of different ways, and it opens up a lot of possibilities for physical and verbal abuse in the washrooms, and it causes a lot of stress and anxiety. But what are we supposed to do? Where are we supposed to go to the washroom? It's like, do you hold it? Do you not hold it? Do you risk it and see what happens? Do you wait until everyone's gone out of the washroom before you leave the stall? There's a lot of different tensions around that. Another one is trans youth should use gender-neutral washrooms. So gender-neutral washrooms can be a good thing, and they could also be a bad thing as well. I also had an experience where I was writing part of this report about gender-neutral washrooms, and the way it was taken up was that trans youth should only use gender-neutral washrooms and not be allowed in the men's or the women's. So that a gender-neutral washroom was like a special washroom for trans youth. And I get like trans youth can like feel like I personally feel more comfortable in a gender-neutral washroom, but it doesn't mean that I shouldn't be allowed to use the men's or the women's washroom either. So it's like it creates a level of comfort, but there's also a level of controversy around whether trans youth should just use the gender-neutral washroom and have that accessible, or to have like 3 washrooms, men's, women's, and a gender-neutral, or to have all washrooms gender-neutral. There's so many different ways that the debate can go with that. So gender-neutral, another point is that gender-neutral washrooms provide a sense of comfort. So they do provide a sense of comfort in a lot of ways. They can provide a sense of discomfort too, because it also identifies you as other. If you look like you're non-binary, or if people can't really tell and they see you, it kind of identifies you as being different. From my experience, a lot of cisgender identified people tend not to use gender-neutral washrooms because they don't necessarily understand the signage. A gender-neutral washroom is there for everybody to use, not just if you identify as trans or non-binary. but because of the signage, some people think that they're not allowed to use it. So there's a little debate around signage as well and how signage should be presented. And the last point too is gender neutral washrooms can be confusing for the cisgender community. So with the signage, it's like you don't know which one you can go into. Is it okay? Do I have to identify as trans in order to use it? But really, it's a washroom. It doesn't really matter as long as you feel safe and comfortable and that you can go. That's the most important point. But to become more inclusive is the main goal. So for the youth sector, there's a lack of inclusive space. This is just from my experience as a youth and going through different services and programs. And not having inclusive space can be pretty detrimental. I have actually stopped going to programs and services because I didn't feel safe in the environment that I was in, and it was causing me a lot of stress and anxiety, even just thinking about going to this program. And in one instance, I was actually the leader. I was a youth leader for a drop-in program after school, and I was volunteering, and I actually had to stop going because the space wasn't safe for me, and I was actually being verbally abused by the younger kids that I was leading and supervising. So it can be pretty detrimental not having a safe space. So basically just take in mind, like, is your organization, program, or youth group, is it trans inclusive? So evaluate your space. Just think about the gender binary when you're making decisions about different things, whether this means having a gender neutral washroom or even removing the signage off existing washrooms, especially if they're single stall, and just putting a sign that says washroom so that anybody can use it. And it often eliminates lineups too, which can be interesting. And for your organization, like, just think about what can be done in a lot of ways. I've found from my experience and my research that if you have anti-discrimination policies that include both gender identity and gender expression, it tends to reduce the amount of discrimination, especially if there is signage posted throughout, or if the discrimination policy is posted on a wall so it's visible. It tends to reduce a lot of hate. And for me, it gives me a sense of comfort to be able to say, well, okay, they're verbally or outwardly saying that this space is safe. And chances are too, like, even if your organization is not trans specific, or you don't work specifically with trans youth, the chances are you're going to come across trans youth anyway. You don't really know if someone is trans or not, because not all people who identify as trans choose to express their gender for multiple reasons, whether it's safety, they don't feel comfortable, or they just don't feel the need to. But you never really know who's trans and who's not. So don't make any assumptions about who's coming into your program, and just take a look. Like, becoming more inclusive for trans-identified youth, like, helps everyone in a way. So it's more safe, more comfortable, and people feel like that you're an open organization. And the recommendations I have would be to, if you're filling out forms or paperwork for your program, don't ask for a person's sex, gender, or sexual orientation unless you actually need the information. I've come across a lot of programs and forms and applications, and, like, whether it's bursaries or job applications, and they ask for your sex, and it's like, is it really necessary? Like, why are you asking for this? Like, what information are you going to be doing with this kind of response? And if you do have to, make sure there's some form of a distinction between sex and gender. They are two different words. They do have two different definitions. There is no one way that's going to work for everybody in this instance. There's no one response that's going to say, oh, this makes sense and all trans people are going to know what to do. You have to think about what your organization needs and what you're doing and how that can become more inclusive. So I would just recommend, like, unless you absolutely have to have that information, don't ask for it. And so make sure the second point is to make sure your space is genuinely inclusive. I've come across a lot of spaces and organizations where they say they're inclusive, but they're doing it to follow along with, like, the fad of this is what's happening. It's like the in thing to be inclusive and trans inclusive. So to really genuinely take a look at what you're doing and to make sure that it is inclusive to the youth and the people that you're working with, not just youth too, but I mean staff as well. And just take the gender binary into consideration. And so the third point is like youth who are coming into your program, whether they're trans or not, they're going to be coming from a lot of different backgrounds, whether it's gender identity, expression, sex, race, culture, religion, socioeconomic status. Take that into consideration too, because oftentimes when you compound different backgrounds with identities, there can be a heightened level of discrimination because of that. From my experience and from my research, Black trans youth have a harder and more difficult time than Caucasian youth simply because they are Black, and that experience compounds on top of being trans. So just be aware of the backgrounds that you're coming from and that your youth are coming from. And the final thing that I have is just educate yourself. I mean, you guys are here at the webinar, so it's really cool. But educate yourself, ask questions, do the research, read books, and just pay attention to what's happening around you and to talk to and listen to your youth. Oftentimes they know what they're talking about, and you can learn a lot from them and from their experiences. And not all youth are going to be comfortable doing this, but if they are, talk to them, find out what works for them, and use that as your guide.
Thank you so much, Jay. That was fantastic. And now I'm going to bring Elizabeth back, and I want to invite all of our guests to ask a question. If you have any based on these two presentations, please type it into the question box. Let's see, I need to get Elizabeth back.
Hi.
Hi, Elizabeth. Thanks. That worked. So first, I think there is a question. It's kind of a Trans 101 question. I'll pose it to Jay. So I have heard people sometimes say transgender and sometimes say transgendered, and I'm wondering for the record which one is correct.
So this is actually a question I've gotten quite a bit, and it's for one I've also messed up as well when I first came out as trans. So there's transgender, and then there's transgendered with an ED. The correct one is transgender. It's a noun, it's not a verb. Someone is transgender, it's an identity of who they are. So it's never with an ED. It's always transgender.
Okay, great. Setting the record straight. Thanks. So this is a question for both of you. Jay, because you were the last to present, maybe you can go first. So we've talked about this difference between gender expression, sex, and gender identity. So as people are gaining awareness about these differences and the many ways that people live their lives outside of a gender binary, what are the implications for youth supporting organizations and services?
I totally just lost that question.
Okay. So as people gain awareness about differences that there's a difference between sex and gender expression, and that there are many ways across the spectrum that people live their lives outside of a gender binary. We've talked about some of the implications around washrooms, and there are some implications around policy, there are implications around people's experience, but I'm wondering if you have any insights on what are kind of the broader implications for youth supporting organizations and services when we start to move away from a gender binary.
It can be a lot of different things. It's incorporating different activities into your programs. So one I always talk about is when you first start into a program or a group, there's often some form of introduction period. And I go through this too with like my classes and the stuff here I do here at the school. And it can be awkward if you identify as trans and you're openly identified as trans, but you want to make sure that your pronoun is right. So what I do when I introduce myself is I'll say my name and I'll say my pronouns. This can be uncomfortable if you're the only one in the group that's giving your pronouns and it identifies you as being different in a lot of different ways, especially if you're non-binary and you use they, them, these are more the gender-neutral pronouns. So I would suggest if you're running an activity or a program and doing an icebreaker, be the first one to introduce yourself and give your pronouns and ask everyone else in the group to do that as well. So that way, those who identify as trans or non-binary aren't being singled out by giving their proper pronouns, and everything's kind of cleared up in the beginning. And it's basically just working different things into your program and just being aware of the fact that you could have trans youth in your program and being aware of how the binary gender system can cause a lot of stress and anxiety in different ways and trying to work around that.
Thanks, Jay. I'll pass the question to Elizabeth, too. Do you have a perspective on that question?
Yeah, I think, it's an important perspective in terms of a lot of different things that happen in daily life. So much of our society is binary, and so much of it sort of policed in a way. The gender police are out there all the time, and so when you have folks who are non-binary or genderqueer or whose gender expression is quite diverse and they aren't necessarily following some sort of script of what has to be, well, guys are always like this and girls are always like this, and that sort of creating a challenge around the diversity of ways that people can be. Young people are increasingly beginning to get that message. I mean, they get it far more than some of the older adults do. And so you actually have cisgendered youth who want to express their gender in different ways. And then you've got folks who are across a spectrum of gender expression. So it becomes important. Things like dress codes are a great example. Those choices of gender segregated sports. What do you do if you're non-binary? Where do you fit? So thinking about that becomes important. In some of the research that we've done, there's a school that we've been working with, and they actually had a number of cisgender folks who, as we were administering a survey on a web, they're all like raising their hand and going, gender's not a binary. And we're like, yes, we know that, but this is a survey that's been done like all over the world, and they've only got these two categories. We said, put that in your box, the comments, and we'll get together with you to figure out what should be an additional response option for the next time we do this survey. And that was really important because although there were maybe only, 1% of the youth who actually identified as non-binary in the school, there were a whole lot of youth who recognized their friends among the group didn't have a box to check, and that's really important. So I think from a youth serving organization place, if you're trying to track information about people, really need to, as Jay said, ask yourself, do you need to know gender? And if you do, you need to include more boxes or more opportunities for people to put those open-ended questions in. But it's also in the way you manage your programming. Are you creating binary spaces or making it uncomfortable for a youth who may identify their gender identity as, say, male, but really prefer some more feminine aspects of their gender expression to be visible, to somehow not be comfortable in those spaces? So it's something to think about in that respect.
Thanks so much. It's so much. I mean, I could respond with a lot more questions, but we have people here who are asking questions, so I'll just hold mine. This question is kind of about systems level change and strategies for systems level change. So this person thanked you for the presentation. They loved it. Thank you so much. They're wondering that, they say, I'm wondering, I've heard a lot of talk about working to make agencies more queer and trans inclusive, but there doesn't seem to be any process or implementation model to A, ensure that agencies are actually moving on trans inclusion across the sector, and B, are doing it in a way that is evidence-informed, built around lived experience, and addresses gaps in care within individual communities. Big question, but would appreciate any thoughts. So I think they're asking, just because it's long, is around like, A, do you know about any processes or models that do ensure that agencies are moving on trans inclusion and are doing it in a way that takes into account evidence lived experience and addresses the gaps in care? So it's kind of like, what are the processes that can support this, or implementation models? Do you know of any? Or, and if you don't know of any, what would you like to see? What would you like to see for that change? Jay,
Big question.
Yeah.
That's a difficult one to answer because there is no one system or strategy that's gonna work. It's very unique to every agency, every organization, every program. Trying to work within your program and to change existing structures is extremely difficult, especially if your organization is not necessarily that trans inclusive or queer inclusive. I would suggest, like, for me, like, if you're working with youth, whether it's in a classroom or a program, just start with you. Start with what you do, and from there, slowly work into the rest of your agency. Because change is never going to be fast, it's never going to be easy, and it's never going to be exactly what you want it to be either. It's a difficult thing to master, and there's nothing that's going to work exactly for everybody. Basically, trying to listen to what's happening and to try, and it doesn't help too that there is not an excessive amount of research on this either. There's more and more research coming out, but it's more, a lot of the research is about the statistics of the struggles of youth and not necessarily about how to move your own organization forward. The best I could say is just listen to the youth who are in your program, educate yourself about what needs to be done and what can be done to change the gender binary, and then look at your agency and see where are your opportunities for advocacy in whatever form, whether it's small or large.
Yeah, I got a few other thoughts on that. One of the things to be really mindful of is that in many provinces, I think it's 7 or 8 of them, thanks to BC this summer finally becoming like the 8th province, gender identity and gender expression is part of the Human Rights Code. So while sometimes managing massive change in systems can be difficult, if you point out in the process that actually the Human Rights Code requires this, and if we don't do something, we may leave our organization open to a human rights complaint, sometimes gets the more stubborn organizations, if you will, or the leadership who doesn't think that there's a need for it, aware. And we hopefully shortly will have a national law that actually mentions gender identity and gender expression in human rights, preventing discrimination. So as a result, that may be one of those extra little nudges to help motivate an organization to actually make some change. How you go about making that change, I think, Jay's spot on in terms of really educating yourself and then listening to the people who you're working with. I think it's really important when people when an organization is thinking about changing or wanting to improve things, that you really need to have the perspectives of people with the lived experience. So if you are wanting to try to make your space more trans-friendly, more queer-friendly, you really need to make sure that you have trans and queer youth you're talking to who can walk through your space and say, I'm not seeing anything that says this is cool. Oh, the little rainbow sticker, that's good, but that's just a start. And can actually talk about the processes, how they experience them. And they can oftentimes come up with things that you never would have thought of in terms of how you actually create your space, how you've trained the people who work in that space to really be regularly engaged in ways that make it safe for everyone. So that's, you really do need to talk to the people who are experiencing the space. And that's a really helpful way of getting those creative solutions. But it doesn't let those of us who are cisgendered off the hook. We have an obligation, a responsibility because of human rights law and because of, just moral and ethical responsibility to educate ourselves, to listen to everyone, and to work to be those champions to make change in a system that seems to be really slow to change.
Thanks. A follow-up question. There are two kind of question themes that I see coming up. There are a lot of questions, by the way, and we're not going to be able to get to them. So we'll do our best, and then we'll in our follow-up webinar recap, we'll address these questions. But the two themes that I'm seeing in the questions that are coming in are between policy, professional development, and practice. So also linking policy to practice. So one person has written in, I see a tendency to try and build inclusive programs, but no real effort put in place to support local agencies that are queer and trans focused. The focus seems to be on making existing programs more trans inclusive rather than creating new programs specifically targeting and engaging trans youth. So I'm wondering, Jay, what are your thoughts on this? So this is a double-pronged question. On the one hand, I think they're asking about, like, people may know that it's their human rights obligation to be a trans-friendly space, but in practice, they don't have the support. And then going back to Elizabeth's point about engaging people like in an advisory council capacity or something. But then the second question was around the difference between making mainstream spaces more trans-inclusive versus making more trans-specific programs. And I'm wondering your thoughts on the pros and the cons of that.
It can be difficult. I have volunteered and worked with both trans-specific programs and then more mainstream programs. What I find especially if you want to create a trans-specific program, it can be difficult to get funding, oftentimes because your service population is going to be fairly small, and it's going to be difficult to get up off the ground. And that's why a lot of times I see more mainstream programs just attempting to be more inclusive, because it's easier to make changes sometimes within a program than it is to create an entirely new program. It is great, I find, to have trans-specific programming. It gives a chance to build connections and community within trans youth, to meet new people and to support each other in different ways. But at the same time, having a more mainstream program that is trans-inclusive incorporates people who are trans into the program and lets them be who they are in an open space, while also helping to educate those who identify as cisgender in that area as well, to help them to see that there is more than just the men, two boxes of men and women. It's really a toss-up. Neither one of them is really better. It all depends on what's going to work in whichever situation. But my experience has been, I have felt discrimination and stress and anxiety in both a specific program as well as a mainstream program. So just because it is a trans-specific program doesn't mean there isn't going to be any discrimination of any sort, because what has to be clear is, like, even within the community, there's discrimination and hate amongst different people for different reasons, whether it has to do with your identity or anything else. And it's difficult to get away from, but it's really a toss-up as to which program is better.
Thanks. One person has written in and asked for a clarification, Elizabeth, on the word, let me find the question, felt gender. They've never heard that before, or they're saying they notice that you're using that term felt gender instead of gender identity. What is the difference, the nuances, and what is the accepted language now?
So that particular question on the survey actually came from existing sort of clinical questions and survey questions. So I have to admit, in the community and in the field, and in different regions across Canada and other parts of the world, the language around trans and gender creative communities is changing at the speed of light. It seems like every other week I get introduced to new terms, new ways of talking about things. When we were doing the survey, young people understood their gender identity, like that question about living in your felt gender, as opposed to the gender that other people were imposing on you from their perspectives, seemed to make sense to a lot of young people around Canada. I'm not sure that it's one that I would use on a regular basis, but I know that when talking to folks who are not transgender and they don't necessarily, when they're still struggling with this notion of gender identity being something separate from and not necessarily automatically the same as the gender or sex you were assigned at birth, or what your body parts may actually be, that notion can be really confusing to people. So the gender that you feel, the gender that you best express, that's your internal sense of self, is what's really being talked about, and that's what gender identity is. But there are a lot of people out there that still haven't read the memo and still don't necessarily understand that gender identity is very much a part of your sense of self, and how you feel, and what it resides as much in your brain as it does in your cells and body. So I think that's, I'm not sure that it's necessarily the only term or the right term, or the term that you should use in any particular encounter. And in fact, I would say, given the diversity of people's understandings of gender, given the diversity of people's chosen terms, and even just the diversity of chosen pronouns that people are taking up, your best bet always is ask. And really, in a respectful and willing to learn way, when you're talking with young people, say, I don't want to make assumptions. Tell me what's going to be the best way for me to speak with you, and how do I understand, what are the terms that you prefer? What are the things, how do you understand this, and how do you describe what's going on in your life, because you are your own best expert.
Thanks, Elizabeth. There's kind of a related question that it's similar. I'll pass it to Jay, and it's at the program level. This person asks, how can we promote self-identification of pronouns without forcing people out of the closet? Like in a group discussion in a small group, if the group leader expresses their pronoun of choice and asks group members to share theirs, would this put some group members in an awkward spot of disclosing when they aren't comfortable yet, or making them say what they outwardly appear?
It can have a lot of different things involved in it. It helps for those who are openly trans and who openly identify as trans. And for those who are completely passing as well as their felt gender, it helps. It can be awkward in a lot of senses for those who identify as cisgender and may not understand or really make the connection as to why we're asking or discussing this, because it's obvious, but it's not really obvious. For a trans individual who is not necessarily out or open as being trans, it will be a decision for them. But for me, like, I'm talking from my experience, it made me feel more comfortable when I wasn't openly trans, to say, okay, this makes sense. They're open about this and they're inclusive to it. So as a person, for me, I would, in that situation, I actually gave the pronouns of my outward expression, which was feminine at that point. But it also gave me the internal feeling of that, okay, this is an inclusive space, it's open and welcoming. So you're never going to completely avoid creating tension, but by doing the pronoun thing, you're asking and you're being more inclusive and aware of the people who are in your space. And if you're not doing something at the program level, if you're not doing like a group activity or like a talking circle kind of thing, if you're doing like name tags, just have pronouns on the name tags, and have a little spot for like name and then pronouns so people can identify in that way too. It's asking for pronouns it's always going to be something that will be an internal battle for a lot of people. But asking for them, at least from my experience, makes people feel more comfortable.
Thanks. We have a lot of questions and we're at 1 o'clock. I'm wondering if it would be okay to go for 10 more minutes. Would that be?
Yep.
Okay. We still won't get to all the questions, but we'll stay on the line for 10 more minutes. So this is a question that speaks to your finding, Elizabeth, that families are a significant protective factor. So this person is asking, in the event that a youth who is trans is not being supported by their family, what kind of supports or other protective factors can a youth worker or a healthcare provider kind of look for? What are other protective factors outside of family if that family support isn't there?
Right, and we do know, sadly, that a lot of families really struggle, and some of them are not only not supportive, but can be outright hostile, and that can be a real problem. We've certainly found in our research that caring adults, period, are really important. And so if family's not supportive, being able to think about supportive school and caring teachers and staff and folks at school, if they're in school, is important. Working with workplaces to be gender affirming and to be supportive is another important way to engage and create safer space for young people. As well, being able to think about if you have the ability to reach out to like Big Brothers, Big Sisters and see if they've got supportive mentors, looking for those local mentorship programs that actually include support for LGBTQ youth, but specifically asking them, yes, but what about the T? And are you really supportive across the gender spectrum? Finding caring adults from whatever, whether it's coaches or school folks or community people, PFLAG or other caring adults, definitely having supportive and caring healthcare providers is going to be supportive for young people. It is important to pay attention to safety issues for young people in terms of their families, but as a growing number of policies across Canada in school settings are making clear, young people have the right to confidentiality, and so you can support their gender identity in school without automatically somehow feeling that you need to out them to parents if it's not a safe environment, or when that may be increasing risks for rejection. Same it should be for youth serving organizations, creating opportunities for people to be affirmed and heard and respected for their gender identity and their pronouns being used and respected is a really important supportive way of fostering young people's health and well-being and creating those supportive friend environments as well. So I do think that's other caring adults can help. Family's important, but other caring adults are another contributor to that.
I can actually speak to that too a little bit. I came out as trans in the second year of my undergrad, and I did my undergrad away from home, so 9-10 months of the year I was away from my family. I was new to the whole thing. I actually never heard the word trans until my first year of my university. And I actually came out to a professor, and that professor has been the most supportive person throughout my entire process so far. She was always the one I could go to, talk to, and we talked a little bit when I told her, and she said, because I didn't know how my family was going to react, especially with my dad, and being away from home, I didn't know how the reaction was going to be, either if I told them over Skype or how it was going to work. So we talked, and she suggested what I would do is build a support network outside of my family. So I slowly came out to really close friends, and I slowly came out to more and more people. I came out to more professors. It came to the point in my undergrad where I was actually living two different lives. So I was Jay at school, and I used he and pronouns in my classes. The school was really accommodating, and allowed me to change my names on all of my academic documents, including my student ID, without having my name legally changed, which was really beneficial. But at the same time, then I go home and I'm living another life, another name, another pronoun, something I'm not comfortable with, but not ready to tell my parents either. But knowing that if when I did tell my parents and it didn't go well, I had a support network I could fall back onto. I had all my friends at school. I had all of my supportive professors, and I knew I would have a support network there if my parents completely rejected me, which thankfully they didn't, and they've been really great with it, but that's not always the case.
That's a great tip. Thanks, Jay. This is a question that goes to professional development. One of these persons says, I noticed that the results from the Trans Youth Health Survey show that there's quite a large role that healthcare providers can play in the well-being of trans youth. So what kind of strategies or suggestions do you have, Elizabeth, for improving the competency of healthcare providers with their trans-identified patients? And do you see this happening in the near future?
Yes. There's actually a lot of work going forward depending on the province you're in. There's activities both in universities where people are, before they actually move out into practice, to become more competent around just trans-friendly, and then also the specific health issues that trans people may come with, but also recognizing that, you know what, when a trans person shows up with the flu, they need the same kind of healthcare as a cisgender person with the flu. You don't need to freak out because it's a trans person there. So there's also, like in BC, TransCare BC is a new provincial sort of centralizing service where the goal is actually to improve the capacity of all GPs across and all the nurse practitioners to provide primary health care for trans people right where they live, and not to have to require a huge amount of gatekeeping, and not to have to require a huge amount of travel to be able to get the care you need, and to ensure that when you do go in for the flu, you have gender affirming and cool care. The Canadian Professional Association of Transgender Health is one of the key organizations that is actually working and advocating across Canada in the different provinces to increase the capacity of healthcare providers who are already out in practice to provide appropriate care and to provide that gender-affirming care across the age range. And I can tell you that we have a conference every other year, and the next one will be in October 27th and beyond, in Vancouver. So we offer, as part of that, I'm happen to be on the board at the moment, and the CPAF offers workshops and seminars for healthcare providers across the range of types of healthcare professionals, and provides information on everything from Trans 101 to providing very specific complex care around particular health issues for trans people. And so the goal is, and I know that there's a lot of active work being done in Ontario, I know that there's a lot of advocacy happening in Nova Scotia to really increase the capacity of family doctors and nurse practitioners and others at the front line of primary care to be more competent and appropriate, culturally appropriate in providing gender affirming care. So yeah, there's a long way to go. There's still a lot more that needs to be done before everywhere is cool, but there's increasing amounts of training happening.
I think you're much further ahead than the youth sector. So the youth sector has just a lot of work to do in terms of organizing and advocating and changing policies and practices. Jay, there's one question that's specifically to you. Someone is asking about washrooms and your experience. Do you find the trend in restaurants with gender-neutral full door stall and open sink with an attendant comfortable?
I've never actually been into one. I haven't had the experience of it. But thinking about it and thinking about what my experience would be walking into it, having a fully co-ed washroom, gender neutral with just a bunch of stalls and a bunch of sinks is great. I don't like the idea of having an attendant there. That to me is still gender policing. You're still, it would make me feel more uncomfortable as to what this person is doing there, whether it's for my own safety or not. To me, that would be really weird. I love having the idea of co-ed washrooms and gender neutral washrooms where it's just a bunch of stalls and anybody can go to the washroom. But I don't like the idea of having an attendant. That's too much like gender policing for me.
Okay, thanks. Are there any final thoughts from our presenters?
Pretty much from me. For me, it's just to keep in mind, the two key points for me to take away from this is to just listen to your youth and who you're working with, and just try and educate yourself about what's happening, and to be aware of your own biases or your own struggles with the trans community, whether it's trying to understand a concept or if it's trying to accept somebody for who they are.
And I think for me, it's really important to remember how important everyone needs caring, respectful, supportive people who accept them and care about them for who they are and give them space to be who they are and be celebrated for that. So I think it's really important to think about where are those ways that you personally can actually be that gender affirming person, whatever your gender is.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saewyc and Jay, for all your insights and for sharing with us today. It was a great webinar. I really appreciate it. And thank you to all our participants, everyone who tuned in today. We'll be posting a webinar recap in a couple of weeks. I encourage you to read both of the reports, and you can follow the research at SARAVYC they do a ton of research around youth health issues that are worth checking out, and YouthREX also has a lot of resources. So if you're interested in more, please check those out. And I'd also like to, in conclusion, invite you to join us at the end of the month. Our next webinar will be on bridging programs to post-secondary education for people who face barriers to accessing and completing post-secondary education programs. So with that, I thank everyone again and say till next time. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you. Bye.